There is a part of our world that defies explanation, a stretch of ocean where the laws of physics seem to bend, where compasses spin wildly, and where the line between our reality and something else grows perilously thin. We have given it a name, a title whispered in a mixture of fear and fascination: the Bermuda Triangle. For decades, it has been a graveyard for ships and planes, a place of silent, inexplicable endings. But of all the stories that haunt these waters, one stands alone, a chilling testament to the unknown that cemented the Triangle's legend forever. This is the story of Flight 19. It's a story you think you know. 5 Navy bombers on a routine training mission, a disoriented pilot, a tragic but understandable loss at sea. That is the official narrative, the sanitized version printed in history books and naval reports. But that is not the whole story. It is not even the beginning of the truth. What has been hidden, redacted, and buried for over 75 years is a far more disturbing tale. We have gained access to the lost archives, the original reports, the uncensored radio transmissions, and the eyewitness accounts that were conveniently dismissed. What they reveal is not a simple case of human error. They reveal a cascade of impossible events, a battle against an unseen force, and a concerted effort by the United States Navy to control a narrative that, if fully known, would challenge our understanding of the world itself. This is the story of the 27 men who were erased from history on December 5, 1945, and the secret that the ocean has kept ever since. To understand the end, we must go back to the beginning. December 5, 1945. The world was breathing a collective sigh of relief. The Second World War, a conflict that had consumed the globe for 6 long years, was finally over. In America, a sense of weary optimism filled the air. Millions of men were returning home, trading their uniforms for civilian clothes, their minds set on building families, careers, and a peaceful future. The machinery of war was slowly winding down, but it had not yet stopped. At the U.S. Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the rhythm of military life continued. The base was a sprawling complex, a critical hub for training the pilots who had helped win the war in the Pacific. Here, young men learned to master one of the most formidable aircraft of its time, the Grumman TBM Avenger. It was a beast of a plane, a torpedo bomber that was rugged, powerful, and instrumental in sinking the pride of the Japanese fleet. To fly an Avenger was to command a piece of American might. The day began like any other in sunny South Florida. A gentle breeze rustled the palm trees, and the sky was a brilliant, almost cloudless blue. The forecast was clear, perfect flying weather. For the 14 airmen assigned to Flight 19, it was just another training day, another step in honing the skills that had become second nature. The mission was designated Navigation Problem Number 1, a routine exercise designed to simulate a combat run. They were to fly a triangular route. First, a leg of 120 miles due east, then a turn north for 73 miles. Finally, a third leg of 120 miles that would bring them straight back to the air station. The flight plan included a practice bombing run at a place called Hens and Chickens Shoals, a cluster of small islands in the Bahamas. It was a textbook mission, one that had been flown hundreds if not thousands of times before without incident. The estimated flight time was just over 3 hours. None of them would be home for dinner. The leader of this flight was a man named Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. At 28 years old, Taylor was a seasoned veteran with over 2,500 flying hours under his belt, many of them in combat. He was an experienced flight instructor, a man entrusted with the lives of the student pilots under his command. Yet, the official story would have you believe that this capable, combat-hardened pilot simply got lost. That he, a man who had navigated the vast and featureless Pacific Ocean, somehow became so disoriented just off the coast of Florida that he led his entire squadron to their deaths. This is the first crack in the official narrative. Taylor was new to Fort Lauderdale, having been transferred there only recently. He was unfamiliar with the local geography, a fact that would later be used against him.
But to suggest that a pilot of his caliber would mistake the Bahamas for the Florida Keys, as the Navy's initial report claimed, is a stretch of credulity. His compasses, the very instruments that were a pilot's lifeline, would have to fail. And not just his, but the compasses in all 5 planes. This is where the mystery truly begins.
The other 13 men of Flight 19 were a mix of seasoned crewmen and young student pilots, all of them members of the Marine Corps or the Navy. They were men like Captain Edward Joseph Powers, a Marine with a wife and child, and Sergeant Howell Orrin Thompson, a radio operator from North Carolina. They were sons, brothers, and husbands. They had survived the war, only to face something far more enigmatic in the skies over their own home.
Let us paint a clearer picture of these men, for they are not mere statistics in a historical footnote. They are the heart of this tragedy. Captain George William Stivers, a Marine pilot, was a quiet, dedicated man from Montana. He had seen action and was known for his calm demeanor under pressure. His crewmen, Sergeant Robert Francis Gallivan and Private First Class Robert Peter Grubel, looked up to him, trusting his judgment implicitly.
Then there was Marine Captain Forrest James Gerber, a newly married man whose wife was waiting for him back on base. His gunner, Private First Class William Earl Lightfoot, was just 19 years old, barely out of his teens, yet entrusted with the lethal power of the Avenger's turret. These were not novices. They were well-trained military men, operating within a system designed for precision and success.
In the 3rd plane, we find 2nd Lieutenant Joseph Tipton Bossy, another Marine pilot, and his crew, Sergeant George Francis Devlin and Sergeant Walter Reed Parpart. Each had their own story, their own dreams of a life after the service. They were part of a generation that had been asked to sacrifice everything, and they had answered the call without hesitation. Now they were on the cusp of that promised future.
4th in the formation was Ensign Joseph Herman, a Navy pilot, flying with Seaman 2nd Class Ralph Anthony Gonzalez. And finally, the 5th plane, piloted by Ensign Charles J. Wharton, with crewman Seaman 3rd Class George R. Payanasa. These were the students, the men learning the intricate dance of navigation and combat from their instructor, Lieutenant Taylor. They trusted him. Their lives were in his hands. As they gathered on the tarmac that afternoon, there was no sense of foreboding. The mood was professional, focused. The pre-flight checks were completed, engines roaring to life in a symphony of mechanical power. At 2:10 p.m., the 5 TBM Avengers of Flight 19 thundered down the runway and lifted into the clear Florida sky, banking eastward over the Atlantic. They were a magnificent sight, a symbol of American victory, flying in perfect formation towards the horizon. For the first hour and a half, everything was perfectly normal. The flight proceeded exactly as planned. They reached the hens and chicken shoals, and radio chatter confirmed they had successfully completed their practice bombing run. The bombs they dropped were dummies, but the procedure was real. It was a flawless execution of a routine maneuver. The squadron then turned north for the 2nd leg of their journey. It was at this point, somewhere over the vast expanse of the Atlantic, that the world began to unravel for the men of Flight 19. The first hint of trouble came not as a frantic distress call, but as a confused and uncertain transmission. It was picked up by another flight instructor, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, who was flying in the vicinity of the Fort Lauderdale Air Station. He heard a voice he recognized as one of the student pilots from Taylor's flight, asking for a compass reading. This was unusual. Students were not supposed to communicate on this frequency unless it was an emergency. Cox radioed back, asking who was transmitting. A moment later, a different voice came over the radio, a voice that was clearly agitated. It was Lieutenant Charles Taylor. His words would become the chilling prologue to one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time. "Both my compasses are out," he said. "I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it's broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." This transmission, logged at approximately 3:45 p.m., was a bombshell to the men listening in the radio control tower back at the air station.
The Florida Keys are a string of islands extending south of the Florida Peninsula. Flight 19's flight plan should have placed them far to the east, over the Bahamas. For them to be over the Keys, they would have had to make a complete, unlogged 180-degree turn after their bombing run. It made no sense. Furthermore, Taylor's statement that both of his compasses were out was highly improbable. The TBM Avenger was equipped with two compasses, a magnetic compass and a gyro compass. For both to fail simultaneously on a single aircraft was rare. For them to fail on all 5 aircraft at the same time was statistically impossible. Yet, this appears to be exactly what was happening. Back on the ground, the controllers scrambled. They knew Taylor was a veteran, but he was new to the area. They reasoned that the broken land he was seeing was not the Florida Keys, but more likely the islands of the Bahamas, exactly where he was supposed to be. If he was in the Bahamas and believed he was in the Keys, any attempt to fly home would be disastrous. Believing he was south of Florida, he would naturally fly north to reach the mainland. But if he was already east of Florida, flying north would only take him further out into the open Atlantic. The controllers tried desperately to convince him of his true position. "What is your course?" they asked. Taylor's replies became increasingly erratic. He was convinced his instruments were failing him. He was relying on what he could see, and what he saw was confusing him. The other pilots in his squadron, the students, began to chime in. Their transmissions, fragments of which were overheard by other planes and listening posts, paint a picture of escalating confusion and fear. One student pilot was heard saying, "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." Another transmission, more chilling, was overheard. "Everything is wrong, strange. The ocean doesn't look as it should." This last statement has been a focal point for researchers for decades. What could make the ocean not look as it should? Was it a reference to the sea state or something far stranger? Lieutenant Cox, the instructor flying near the coast, established a solid radio link with Taylor. He urged him to put the sun on his port wing and fly west. If he was anywhere near Florida, that simple maneuver would bring him back to land. But Taylor seemed unable or unwilling to trust this advice. He was fixated on his belief that he was over the Gulf of Mexico, having somehow flown west from the Keys instead of east from the mainland. "I know where I am now," Taylor radioed at one point with a false sense of confidence. "I'm at 2,300 feet. Don't come after me." This was a bizarre command. Was it the bravado of a flight leader trying to maintain control, or was he seeing something that made him believe a rescue attempt would be futile or even dangerous? As the afternoon wore on, the situation deteriorated. The weather, which had been perfect at the start of the flight, began to turn. A front was moving in, bringing with it high winds, torrential rain, and rough seas. The clear blue sky was replaced by a ceiling of ominous gray clouds. Visibility dropped. For a squadron of lost planes, it was a death sentence. We have to pause and consider the human element in this unfolding drama. Imagine being one of those young pilots, thousands of feet in the air, with nothing but water in every direction. Your instruments, the tools you have been trained to trust with your life, are giving you nonsensical readings. Your flight leader, the experienced veteran, is just as lost as you are. Below you, the sea is turning into a churning, angry monster. And your fuel gauges are ticking relentlessly towards empty. The conversations between the pilots, pieced together from the official logs, are heartbreaking. At one point, Taylor seems to hand over command to another pilot, only to take it back again. There is a debate about which direction to fly. Some believe they should head west. Taylor, still convinced he is over the Gulf, insists they fly east. It was another fatal decision, taking them ever deeper into the vastness of the Atlantic. At 4:56 p.m., the radio tower in Fort Lauderdale managed to get a fix on Flight 19's position. The signal placed them somewhere east of the Florida coast, north of the Bahamas, and far out to sea. They were exactly where the controllers had suspected. They relayed this information, but it is unclear if Taylor ever received it or believed it. By this time, his transmissions were growing weaker, a sign that his plane's electrical system might be failing, or that he was simply flying further and further away. One of the most telling and tragic transmissions came around 6 p.m. A student pilot was heard saying, "If we were to fly west, we would get home." Taylor's reply was firm. He had made a decision. He ordered the squadron to fly a new course. When one plane's fuel dropped to 10 gallons, they would all ditch together in the sea. It was a standard procedure for a lost flight, a last-ditch effort to keep the crews together and increase their chances of survival and rescue. But the archives reveal something more, a detail often omitted from the retelling of the story. In one of the final, garbled transmissions, operators on the ground thought they heard the letters FT, FT. This was the prefix for the planes of Flight 19. But it was what came after that was so disturbing. The operators could not be sure, but it sounded like the message was not from the flight leader, but about him. The fragmented words suggested the other pilots knew their leader was wrong, that they were flying in the wrong direction, but military discipline, or perhaps the sheer chaos of the situation, prevented them from breaking formation. At 6:20 p.m., Taylor was heard giving his final command. "We will have to ditch unless landfall is made. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." The logic was sound, but the premise was flawed. They were not approaching landfall. They were flying into a storm over some of the deepest and most treacherous waters in the Atlantic. The last radio transmission from Flight 19 was picked up at 7:04 p.m. It was faint, distorted by static, a ghost of a voice reaching out across the churning water. The message was unintelligible. And then there was only silence. 5 U.S. Navy bombers carrying 14 men had vanished from the sky. Back at Fort Lauderdale, the silence was deafening. The men in the control tower stared at their radio equipment, hoping, praying for another transmission. But none came. The flight had been in the air for nearly 5 hours. Their fuel would be gone. The reality of the situation began to sink in. A full-blown emergency was declared. The largest air and sea search in naval history up to that point was about to begin. But the mystery of December 5, 1945, was not over. In fact, it was about to deepen. As the search and rescue operation swung into high gear, another aircraft was dispatched to scour the last known position of Flight 19. It was a PBM-5 Martin Mariner flying boat, a massive aircraft with a crew of 13 men. Its call sign was Training 49. The Martin Mariner was a workhorse of the Navy, a reliable plane used for patrols and rescue missions. But it had a notorious and deadly flaw. It was nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank. Vapors would often collect in its fuselage, and a single spark could cause a catastrophic explosion. Despite this known risk, it was the best tool available for a nighttime search over a stormy sea. At 7:27 p.m., the Mariner, Bureau number 59225, lifted off from the Naval Air Station at Banana River, Florida. The crew of 13, led by Lieutenant Walter G. Jeffrey, was a team of experienced search and rescue specialists. They knew the dangers, but it was their job to fly into harm's way to save others. They headed east towards the last estimated position of the lost squadron. At 7:30 p.m., just 3 minutes after takeoff, the Mariner made a routine radio call, reporting its position and that it was on its way to the search area. It was the last message anyone would ever hear from them. The plane, with its 13 crewmen, flew on into the darkening, storm-tossed night, and like Flight 19 before it, vanished without a trace. However, the disappearance of the Mariner was not as silent. At approximately 7:50 p.m., the crew of a tanker ship, the SS Gaines Mills, was battling the rough seas in the same area. The captain and several crew members on deck saw something they would never forget. A brilliant flash of light in the sky. a massive fireball that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before plummeting towards the ocean. They reported seeing an explosion, followed by a column of fire on the water that burned for 10 minutes. The captain of the Gaines Mills immediately plotted the position of the explosion and altered course to investigate. They arrived at the scene to find a large oil slick and the strong smell of aviation fuel, but no wreckage, no bodies, no survivors. Nothing but the debris-strewn, churning surface of the Atlantic. The location of this explosion coincided almost perfectly with the last known position of the Martin Mariner. This event provides the official and most likely explanation for the fate of the rescue plane. It exploded in mid-air. A tragic accident, a terrible coincidence on a night already fraught with disaster. But the mystery enthusiasts and researchers who have studied the case for decades ask a critical question. Was it a coincidence? Or was the Mariner destroyed by the same phenomenon that had claimed Flight 19? Think about the sequence of events. 5 military aircraft disappear. A rescue plane sent to find them also disappears in a fiery explosion. In a single evening, 6 aircraft and 27 American servicemen are lost without a single piece of wreckage being recovered. The official narrative would have you believe these are 2 separate, unrelated tragedies that just happened to occur on the same night in the same location. But that explanation begins to feel inadequate when you consider the sheer scale of the loss. The search for Flight 19 and the Martin Mariner was colossal. Over the next 5 days, the Navy and Coast Guard threw everything they had into the effort. More than 300 aircraft and 21 ships scoured over 250,000 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. They searched day and night, improving weather conditions. The search area was vast, but the effort was meticulous. They were looking for anything: a life raft, a seat cushion, an oil slick, a single piece of floating debris. They found nothing, absolutely nothing. Not a single trace of the 5 Avenger bombers. Not a single piece of wreckage from the exploded Martin Mariner beyond the initial oil slick reported by the Gaines Mills. It was as if 6 aircraft and 27 men had been plucked from the sky, erased from existence. For a plane like the Avenger, which was built like a tank and designed to withstand ditching at sea, to disappear so completely was baffling. Even if the planes had broken up on impact, a massive debris field should have been created. This total lack of evidence is perhaps the most enduring and unsettling aspect of the Flight 19 mystery. It defies logical explanation. The ocean is vast, but it is not a magical void. Things that go into it, especially things as large as 5 bombers, leave a trace. But in this case, the ocean kept its secret. The search was eventually called off. The 14 men of Flight 19 and the 13 men of the Martin Mariner were officially declared dead. Their families received dreaded telegrams informing them that their loved ones were lost at sea, cause unknown. This is where the story should end, as a tragic but explainable military accident. But it is where the story of the cover-up begins. The Navy was faced with an unprecedented and embarrassing situation. They had lost 6 of their aircraft and 27 of their men in a single training exercise off their own coast. They needed an explanation, a neat and tidy conclusion to close the book on the affair. A Navy Board of Inquiry was convened to investigate the incident. They reviewed the radio logs, interviewed the personnel from the control tower, and analyzed the flight plan. Their conclusion, detailed in a 500-page report, was swift and decisive. They placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of one man, the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor. The report concluded that Taylor, confused by the failure of his compasses, had made a critical error in judgment. It stated that he mistakenly believed he was over the Florida Keys and, against the advice of both ground control and some of his own pilots, led his squadron in the wrong direction, further out to sea, until they ran out of fuel and crashed in the storm. The loss of the Martin Mariner was officially attributed to a mid-air explosion, treated as a separate and coincidental accident. Pilot error.
It was a simple, clean explanation. It absolved the Navy of any equipment failure or procedural shortcomings. It provided a scapegoat, a dead man who could not defend himself. The case was closed. But the families of the lost airmen, and particularly Taylor's mother, were not satisfied. They knew the men, they knew their capabilities, and the official story did not add up.
Mrs. Taylor launched her own investigation, petitioning the Navy for a review of the findings. She argued that it was unfair to blame her son for the loss when there was no physical evidence to support any conclusion. She pointed out that the Navy was essentially blaming him for getting lost, without explaining why a veteran combat pilot and his entire squadron would become so hopelessly disoriented in the first place. What caused the initial problem? Why did all the compasses fail?
Her persistence paid off. Several months later, the Navy quietly amended its report. The finding of pilot error was rescinded. The official cause of the loss of Flight 19 was changed to cause unknown. This was a significant reversal. It was a tacit admission by the Navy that their initial conclusion was not supported by the facts, that they did not know what happened to Flight 19. But this revised finding was not widely publicized. The narrative of pilot error had already taken hold in the public consciousness.
And what of the lost archives? The term refers not to a single hidden vault of documents, but to the collection of inconsistencies, suppressed testimony, and unanswered questions that litter the official record. For example, the Navy's report downplayed the severity and strangeness of the radio transmissions. The phrase, "the ocean doesn't look as it should," was omitted from many public summaries. The debate among the pilots about which direction to fly was condensed into a simple narrative of Taylor's singular confusion.
Furthermore, there are persistent rumors and accounts from researchers that not all of the radio transmissions were logged in the final report. Some claim that there were other, stranger messages intercepted by amateur radio operators and military listening posts. Messages that spoke of white water, a white haze, and a complete inability to see the sky or the horizon. These accounts are anecdotal and difficult to prove, but they form a consistent thread in the lore surrounding the incident, suggesting the planes flew into some kind of bizarre, localized atmospheric or electromagnetic phenomenon.
Consider the compass problem again. The official report acknowledges that Taylor claimed his compasses were out, but treats it as a simple mechanical failure that should have been manageable. An experienced pilot has other ways to navigate: the sun, the coastline, basic dead reckoning. But what if it wasn't a simple mechanical failure? What if an external force was rendering the compasses useless? In a world before the widespread use of GPS, a pilot's compass was his connection to reality. To lose it was to be cast adrift in a featureless world.
Decades later, researchers like Andy Morocco would compile the original, unedited Navy reports, making them accessible to the public. These documents, the true archives of the case, reveal a far more complex and puzzling picture than the official summary. They show a ground control team that was itself confused, giving conflicting advice at times. They show that other pilots in the area reported unusual radio interference and magnetic anomalies on the afternoon of December 5th. Then there is the work of Larry Cush, a librarian and pilot who, in 1975, published a book titled The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved. Cush conducted a meticulous investigation, reviewing the same official reports. His conclusion was that the legend of Flight 19 was a manufactured mystery, a product of embellishment and poor research by sensationalist authors. He argued that Taylor was indeed to blame, that the weather was far worse than often reported, and that there was nothing supernatural about the incident at all. Cush's work is often cited as the definitive debunking of the Flight 19 myth, and he makes some valid points. The weather did turn bad. Taylor was new to the area. A series of human errors compounded by bad luck could certainly lead to a tragedy. But Cush's explanation, like the Navy's original report, feels too neat, too dismissive of the truly bizarre elements of the case. He explains what might have happened, but he cannot explain the why. Why did the compasses fail? Why was there no wreckage? Why did Taylor, a combat veteran, become so utterly and completely lost? The story of Flight 19, a tragedy in its own right, soon became something more. It became the foundational myth of the Bermuda Triangle. In 1964, author Vincent Gaddis wrote an article for Argosy magazine titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle. He recounted the story of Flight 19 and connected it to a string of other unexplained disappearances in the same region. Gaddis was the one who drew the lines on the map, from Bermuda to Miami to Puerto Rico, and gave the phenomenon its iconic name. 10 years later, in 1974, Charles Berlitz published his blockbuster book, The Bermuda Triangle, which became a global phenomenon. Berlitz presented the story of Flight 19 not as an accident, but as a paranormal event, a case of abduction by an unknown force. He sensationalized the details, sometimes inaccurately, but he tapped into a deep-seated public fascination with the unknown and a growing distrust of official explanations. Berlitz's book cemented Flight 19 as the poster child for the triangle. He linked it to other chilling and well-documented cases. Cases like the USS Cyclops, a massive Navy collier ship that vanished with 306 souls on board in 1918. It was a 542-foot-long vessel, a floating giant that disappeared without a distress call on a calm sea. No wreckage was ever found. The Navy's own investigation concluded, no plausible theory of the vessel's disappearance has ever been adjudicated. Then there were the cases of the Star Tiger and the Star Ariel, two state-of-the-art British airliners that vanished in the same area, a year apart, in 1948 and 1949. Both were flying in good weather. Both made routine radio calls shortly before they disappeared. And then silence. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. The official report into the loss of the Star Tiger is one of the most baffling documents in aviation history. The chief investigator wrote, "What happened in this case will never be known, and the fate of Star Tiger must remain an unsolved mystery." He concluded that the loss was due to some external cause, but could not imagine what it might be. These cases and dozens of others create a disturbing pattern. Ships found adrift with no crew, like the Connemara 4 in 1955. Military aircraft that vanish in pairs, like the two KC-135 stratotankers that disappeared in 1963. While debunkers are quick to point out that many of these incidents have logical explanations, the KC-135s, for example, were later found to have collided mid-air, a fact often omitted by mystery writers. The core group of truly inexplicable cases remains. The U.S. Coast Guard and other official bodies do not recognize the Bermuda Triangle as a unique area of hazard. They correctly state that the region has heavy air and sea traffic and experiences extreme and unpredictable weather, like hurricanes and rogue waves, which can account for many losses. The insurance market Lloyd's of London does not charge higher premiums for vessels transiting the area. Statistically, they argue, the number of disappearances is not abnormally high. But this statistical argument misses the point. It is not the number of disappearances that is so compelling. It is the nature of them, the suddenness, the lack of distress calls, and most importantly, the complete and total absence of wreckage in a significant number of cases. It is this element of erasure, of being wiped from the face of the earth, that connects Flight 19 to the broader mystery of the triangle. So, if we reject the simple explanation of pilot error and bad weather, what are we left with? What could have happened to the 27 men of Flight 19 and the Martin Mariner? The lost archives and the decades of research have produced a number of alternative theories, ranging from the scientific to the truly fantastic. These are the possibilities that the official narrative refuses to consider. One of the most compelling scientific theories involves methane hydrates. The seabed in this region is known to contain vast, frozen deposits of methane gas. It is theorized that a sudden shift in temperature or pressure, perhaps caused by a seismic event, could trigger a massive eruption of this gas. The result would be a gigantic, frothing plume of gas-filled water on the surface.
Any ship caught in this plume would lose its buoyancy instantly and sink like a stone, pulled to the bottom in seconds. If such an eruption occurred beneath an aircraft, it could create a pocket of low-density air, causing the plane to lose lift and fall from the sky. Or the methane gas itself could be ingested by the engines, causing them to stall or even explode. This theory could explain the suddenness of the disappearances and the lack of wreckage, as the vessels would be pulled down too quickly for a distress call and buried in the silt of the ocean floor. Could Flight 19 and the Mariner have been victims of a massive, unseen geological event? Another theory focuses on the region's unique electromagnetic properties. The Bermuda Triangle is one of only two places on Earth, the other being the Devil's Sea off the coast of Japan, where true north and magnetic north align. This can and does play havoc with traditional magnetic compasses. Some have theorized that this area is prone to sudden, massive electronic fog or electromagnetic storms that are invisible to the naked eye. This electronic fog would not be a weather phenomenon in the traditional sense, but a powerful energy field that could disrupt or disable all electronic equipment on a plane or ship. It would explain why Taylor's compasses and those of his squadron all failed simultaneously. It would explain the garbled radio transmissions and the potential failure of the Mariner's electrical systems, leading to a spark in the fuselage. The descriptions of a white haze or white water could be the visual manifestation of such an event, a kind of ionized air phenomenon. The planes would essentially be flying blind, their instruments dead, their radios useless, into a disorienting and inescapable trap. This theory has been given some credence by pilots who have reported strange occurrences in the area. Bruce Gernon, a Florida-based pilot, claims to have flown through such an electronic fog in 1970. He described a bizarre tunnel-shaped cloud that seemed to pull his plane in. His navigational instruments went haywire, and he experienced a form of time distortion, arriving at his destination a full 30 minutes earlier than was physically possible, having covered a distance in a time that would have required an impossible airspeed. Gernon's story, while anecdotal, is one of many that suggests there are forces at play in the triangle that we do not yet understand. Of course, no discussion of the Bermuda Triangle would be complete without considering the possibility of extraterrestrial involvement. For many, the idea of alien abduction is the only explanation that fits the bizarre facts of the Flight 19 case. The complete disappearance of 6 aircraft without a trace seems less like a crash and more like a clean removal. The theory posits that the Bermuda Triangle is a hotspot for UFO activity, a kind of window or portal area used by extraterrestrial visitors. Proponents point to numerous UFO sightings in the region, including reports from military personnel and even Christopher Columbus himself, who logged seeing strange lights in the sky and on the water in his journal during his first voyage through the area. In this scenario, Flight 19 did not get lost and crash. They were intercepted. The compass failures and radio interference were the result of a powerful energy field from an alien craft. The strange descriptions of the ocean and sky were the pilots' attempts to describe something utterly outside their frame of reference. The Martin Mariner, arriving on the scene, met the same fate. They were not destroyed, they were taken. It is a fantastic theory, one that lies far outside the realm of conventional science. But for those who believe we are not alone in the universe, it provides a chillingly complete, if unprovable, answer. There is one final theory, one that is perhaps the most disturbing of all, because it brings the mystery back from the heavens and grounds it in the dark corners of human activity. This is the theory of a government cover-up, not to hide a natural phenomenon or an alien encounter, but to conceal a secret military operation gone horribly wrong. Consider the time period late 1945. The war was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. The United States was in possession of a new and terrifying power, the atomic bomb.
and it was frantically experimenting with other advanced technologies, from radar invisibility to new forms of propulsion and weaponry. Much of this research was top secret, conducted in remote locations, far from prying eyes. What if Flight 19, on its routine training mission, accidentally flew into the middle of such a secret test? A test of an electromagnetic pulse weapon, a new type of energy field, or even an early attempt at teleportation or time travel. An echo of the infamous Philadelphia experiment, which supposedly took place 2 years earlier. If the squadron was inadvertently destroyed or disintegrated by a secret weapon, the government would have every reason to cover it up. In this scenario, the story of the lost, confused pilot would be a deliberately crafted piece of disinformation. The radio logs could have been altered or selectively edited to support this narrative. The massive search that found nothing might not have been a failure, but a success at recovering any incriminating evidence before it could be found by the public. The disappearance of the Martin Mariner could have been a secondary, tragic accident, or it too could have been deliberately eliminated to silence any potential witnesses who might have seen something they weren't supposed to. The change in the official report from pilot error to cause unknown could be seen not as a victory for Taylor's family, but as a strategic move by the Navy. Cause unknown is a final, impenetrable wall. It closes the case without providing any real answers, leaving the truth buried forever under a mountain of classified documents and official denials. This theory paints the U.S. government not as an incompetent investigator, but as a ruthless protector of its own dark secrets. So, where does that leave us? 4 distinct theories, each attempting to explain the impossible. A violent act of nature, a bizarre electromagnetic anomaly, an encounter with the extraterrestrial, or a sinister human conspiracy. The truth may be one of these, or a combination of them, or something else entirely that we cannot yet comprehend. What we are left with is the human cost of this enduring mystery. 27 men went to work on the morning of December 5, 1945, and never came home. They left behind wives, children, parents, and friends, all of whom were left to grapple with a loss that had no explanation, no closure. For them, the Bermuda Triangle was not a source of thrilling speculation. It was a source of lifelong pain and unanswered questions. Let us remember their names one last time. The 14 men of Flight 19, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, Captain Edward Powers, Captain George Stivers, Captain Forrest Gerber, Second Lieutenant Joseph Bossie, Ensign Joseph Herman, Ensign Charles Wharton, and their crewmen, Sergeant Howell Thompson, Sergeant Robert Gallivan, Private First Class Robert Grubel, Private First Class William Lightfoot, Sergeant George Devlin, Sergeant Walter Parpart, Seaman Ralph Gonsalves, and Seaman George Poona. And the 13 men of the Martin Mariner rescue plane, Lieutenant Walter Jeffrey, Lieutenant Harry Cohn, Ensign Charles Arsino, Ensign Lloyd Eliason, Ensign James Jordan, Petty Officer 2nd Class John Menendez, Petty Officer 3rd Class Alfred Proper, Petty Officer 3rd Class Wiley Cargill, Seaman 1st Class James Osterheld, Seaman 1st Class Donald Peterson, Seaman 1st Class Philip Neiman, Seaman Robert Cameron, and Seaman 2nd Class Joseph Wentrizak. These were real people with real lives who were caught in the gears of something inexplicable. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that for all our technology, for all our scientific progress, there are still vast areas of our world that remain profoundly and terrifyingly unknown. The official story of Flight 19 is a story of simple human failure. But the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the enduring silence from the depths of the ocean suggest a far more complex and disturbing truth. The lost archives of Flight 19 are not just dusty files in a naval repository. They are the fragmented radio calls echoing in the static of history. They are the eyewitness accounts that were dismissed, the strange phenomena that were ignored, and the 27 empty chairs at family dinner tables. The legend of the Bermuda Triangle was not born from fiction. It was born from a very real, very tragic, and very strange event that has defied explanation for 3/4 of a century. The search for answers continues. Wreckage hunters and deep-sea explorers still comb the ocean floor, hoping to find a piece of an Avenger that would finally solve the puzzle. In 1991, a salvage expedition did find a group of 5 Avenger bombers on the seabed off the coast of Florida. And for a brief, electrifying moment, the world thought Flight 19 had been found. But a check of the serial numbers revealed they were from a different squadron, all lost in separate incidents at different times. The lost patrol remains lost.
Perhaps it is not meant to be found. Perhaps the story of Flight 19 is destined to remain a mystery, a modern myth that speaks to our deepest fears of the unknown. It is a story that challenges our sense of control, our belief that we have mapped and conquered every corner of our planet. It reminds us that the world is still a wild and mysterious place, and that sometimes, when you fly out over the horizon, you might not come back.
The silence that fell over the radio waves at 7:04 p.m. on December 5, 1945, has never truly been broken. It lingers over the waters of the Bermuda Triangle, a permanent, haunting question mark. The official explanation is a whisper against the roar of that silence. The truth, whatever it may be, was sealed that day, locked away in the lost archives and buried deep in the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic. And it is there, in that abyss of the unknown, that the 27 men of Flight 19 and Training 49 remain, forever a part of the world's greatest and most chilling unsolved mystery.